Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, good day. Let me introduce myself. My name is Tasya Wulandari and I am from 5B class. In this great opportunity, I would like to tell you about the hypothesis. Let's start it with the definition. When we are going to some place, have you ever seen an accident? I think everyone who see the accident will guess the possibilities why it can be happen. Realize it or not, when we are guess it, we are is doing research. Why? Because the real answers is still looking for by the several witnesses or so the existing evidence. So the summary of the definition hypothesis definition is the summary of a problem that temporarily, so that is still needed to be tested through the analysis by looking for the data in the field. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Is about the hypothesis function. When we are going to the field to look for the data, we will find many kinds of the data. So it can make us confused from where or from what we will start the data itself. So the function of the hypothesis is to limit and minimize the scope of research, to facilitate data collection and processing, to determine the type, number and relationship of research variables, and to determine dependent variable that must be controlled. Okay, go on to the next slide. It's about the basic formulating a hypothesis. The first is the based on theory. It means that the theory is we find the theory that relating theory that has established by in the society. And the second and the third is about the based on previous and preliminary research. It means that we are looking for the empirical facts or info from the previous or preliminary research. And the fourth is based on research common sense. It means that it is based on the assumption, it based on the researcher's own imaginative concept or theory assumptions to complement empirical. It means that the analytic skill is very helpfully for the researchers itself, and it can, if it all done, I mean the basic formulating is done, the structure will logically and systemically, and it become the hypothesis reasonable and rational, and has strong basic. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Is about the hypothesis development structure. After we have so many, after we are looking for the data, and also we have find the theory, the theory, and also the previous research result, we go on to the hypothesis development structure. We can see in this slide there are first is we put the theory first, and the next we put the previous research result. Then we can add the logic of thought that supports the hypothesis 1 from our or from the researchers itself, from the researchers. Let's go. From the researchers. Go on to the next slide. Is the types of hypothesis. There are 3 types of the hypothesis. The first is researchers or work hypothesis. It means that the researcher's hypothesis is the researcher's basic assumptions of a problem being studied. The second is operational hypothesis. Operational hypothesis is an objective hypothesis. In this hypothesis, the researchers need a comparative hypothesis that is objective and natural or technically called the null hypothesis. And the last one is the statistical hypothesis. From the name, we know that it is related to the number. It is related to the number, so that the meaning of the statistical hypothesis is the type of a hypothesis that is formulated in the form of statistical notation based on Umi, Nariuma, Wita, and friends' definition. Let's go on to the next slide. It's about the formulate a hypothesis. The first is how to formulate a hypothesis. The first step is study the theory first. Then after study the theory, we can go on to the facts based on observation or experience of the researchers. And then the next is researchers' guesswork and knowledge, like what I stated before, that it is based on the researchers' skills, analytic skills, and then the last step is the relevant previous research, so that the researchers needs to find the previous research. And the second is about the hypothesis testing technique. The technique is by using the statistical test, for example, t-test and so on. And go on to the next slide is about the example of formulating hypothesis. The example for the researchers work hypothesis is there is a relationship between online learning performance and student satisfaction, because as we know, as what I stated before, that this hypothesis is coming from the researchers itself, the researchers knowledge. And then the second is operational hypothesis. The operational hypothesis, the example is there is no effect of the COVID pandemic-19 on the performance of MSMES. And the hypothesis 1 is hypothesis null is there is no effect of the COVID pandemic-19 on the performance of MSMES, and the hypothesis 1 is there is an influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on the performance of MSMES. And then the third example is coming from the statistical hypothesis. This hypothesis is formulated based on the researchers' observation of the population in the form of numbers, quantitative, for example, hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2, hypothesis 1 or hypothesis 0. Go on to the next slide. Is about the associative, is still about the example, is associative hypothesis. But before that, let me tell you what is the definition of the associative hypothesis. The associative hypothesis is a temporary answer to the problem formulation in which question the relationship between two. It is relationship between two researchers' variables. So that the example, I take the example, is there a relationship between leadership style and employee performance. And then go on to the next slide is about the descriptive hypothesis. The definition of the descriptive hypothesis is assumptions or answer to the descriptive problem related to the single or independent variable. So the example, I take the example, how big is the mastery of English among students? So the researchers only look for one theory or one previous research. And then go on to the next slide is about the comparative hypothesis. As in the comparative hypothesis, from the name, we are already know that this hypothesis is answer the problem formulation that is used to question a comparison or between the two researchers. Two research variables. So that I take the example. What is the attitude of students in Bandung towards the use of social media that is compared to the attitude of the students in Yogyakarta? Okay, go on to the next slide. The next slide is about the researchers' needs. When the researchers wants to research, it is very neat to them remember this. The first is training for the researchers team. If the research is too large, of course we need our team. Then the team is trained. The team is very need to trained. Why? Because it is expected that the accuracy and standardization of the research techniques will determine because the techniques will determine the quality of the research. The second is the team group training. The team group training will determine the overall research result. And the next is coding techniques. Because after we are collected all the data, the raw data encoded for both manually and statistically analyzed by the computer. So that the coding techniques is also needed. The next is external validity. It relates to the environment, and the data taken is as likely as possible. It means that we need to find the real environment or the related environment. And then the last one is the meaning and significance. It means that the significance is obtained through hypothesis testing. Otherwise, it must see the value and the meaning. It means that after all is already, we need to make it sure that it is already significant and it is already testing, so that we can find it has the value and also the meaning. Go on to the last slide is about what is the hypotheses that are not proven or acceptable. The first is the theories are outdated and irrelevant, and then the data is invalid because the collection tools for empirical tests and the data is outdated and unreliable. The next is sampling is incorrect or too small. The formulation of the problem is not in the line with the underlying theory. And the data processing design doesn't meet the assumption, and interpretation of data processing result, and the facts are not in accordance with the theory used as a reference, and etc. I think that's all about my presentation. Thank you for your great attention, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.